This is Pamela Smythe from the University of Waterloo. I'm one of the hosts of Beyond the Bulletin, the podcast of internal communications at the university. We bring you news and views from the U-Waterloo community. Please spread the word that we're on SoundCloud.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And now the interview from episode 46 of Beyond the Bulletin, originally broadcast on May 29th, 2020. As Waterloo's first Dean of Engineering, Doug Wright had a major role in shaping the priorities of what would become Canada's largest engineering school. Wright also left a lasting effect as Waterloo's third president and vice-chancellor. With more on his legacy, here's my conversation with historian Ken McLaughlin. Hello, Ken. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Pamela.
When did you first meet Doug Wright?
I met Doug when I was a student in about 1962. I was in St. Jerome's college residence, and in walked Doug Wright, whom we all knew as Dean of Engineering, with a representative from the Laughlin Foundation in England. And he came up to me and said, I have this visitor from England. He'd like to see one of your rooms. Could you show him your room? He was interested in the structural technique that St. Jerome's had used to build. And I was fascinated because, someone from England coming to look at our room with the Dean of Engineering was pretty exciting for a young undergraduate.
So did you let them in?
I did let them in, and I was fascinated to watch UW engineers win Athlone scholarships shortly after.
But you went on to work at St. Jerome's. So you started as a student, then you went on to work at St. Jerome's, and then you socialized with Doug Wright when he was president. You were the Dean of St. Jerome's. Is that correct?
I think so. Well, I was Dean, and probably during the time when Doug was president. What I remember was being at Senate, and the Dean of St. Jerome's was elected to Senate, but not automatically. And I loved the way Doug Wright ran Senate. He had no tolerance for people who were just speaking to hear themselves speak, and his capacity to run that meeting quickly and efficiently was wonderful. Doug was, as president, chaired the meetings of Senate, and so he and the university secretary sat up at the front, and everyone faced the chair.
He didn't suffer fools, so to speak.
That's exactly it. He didn't suffer fools at all.
So you socialized with him, though. You went to his home. Tell me what that was like. What was he like socially?
Wonderful. He was a great raconteur and storyteller, and he had this wonderful home over on George Street, a historic house that he had lived in when he was Dean of Engineering. So when he came back as president, he abandoned what was then the presidential house owned by the university on Westgate Walk and took over his old house. And it was a wonderful house. And he would often talk about the house, about the things that they'd done to restore it. But it was a social setting in that house. I remember chatting often with Paige Wadsworth, who was the chancellor, who regularly came as well, and Peter Sims, who was the chair of the board. And they all just sat around together in this wonderful old historic property and chatted. It was really quite amazing. We talked about the community and about the university and about fixing Doug's roof and his house.
Well, he needed help fixing a roof. Isn't he a roof expert? Didn't he work on the Sky Dome and the Forum?
Different kind of roof, and he needed a roofer locally who would work on historic properties because many roofing companies only did new houses. So he was looking for a reference for a roofer who could work on a historic property. We live in an 1867 house, and we had a roofer to recommend to him. So, it's kind of fun to talk about Doug that way as opposed to the serious things he did as president.
Well, I do want to get into those, but before I do, I hear that he was a man of many interests.
Voracious interests. And I know friends of mine who were teaching English literature, for example, who would say to me, "Oh, God, I hate it when Doug Wright phones because he always wants to talk about so many different things, and you can never get off the phone because he was so fascinated with ideas." And I think, this is not what you think of as an engineer and a president who's talking to someone in English literature full of ideas, endless ideas. And that's what he said. The ideas are endless and you can't get off the phone. So it is kind of fun to see that part of him,
Well, he was 92 when he passed away just recently, and I heard that he had 88 books on hold at his local branch of the Toronto Public Library. So that's somebody with a lot of interest and an active mind.
Well, that is somebody with a lot of interest. And my favorite story recently was last summer when we were traveling in New Brunswick on the Bay of Fundy, and I kept getting emails from Doug Wright in Toronto wanting me to send a copy of Watt Times to the wife of Mike Brooks, who was one-time property manager at Waterloo. And I'm thinking, Doug Wright's 91 years old, and here I am in the middle of New Brunswick, and I'm engaging in detailed conversation. And I think that's kind of fun because that talks about his interests and his loyalty to his friends, which was also pretty striking.
And his interest in Waterloo still.
Oh, yeah.
That was when you were editor of Watt Times,
Watt
correct?
Times, yeah.
Yeah, which is for those who don't know, it's a publication for retirees of the University of Waterloo.
That's right. And we did a feature on Mike Brooks, the man who designed the early years of the campus. And Doug wanted Mike Brooks's widow to get a copy of Watt Times and finding a way to send it. And he was getting her address, and he'd already spoken to her in England.
Right. Well, it was great of you to not just say, I'm on vacation. That's a credit to you too, Ken.
Well, it wouldn't matter to Doug. He was unstoppable and
Wow.
things like that.
Let's talk about him as president. So tell me about some of the notable contributions to the university. Maybe first, let's talk about him as the Dean of Engineering. He was Waterloo's first Dean of Engineering, which is a really major, it's a milestone both for the university and for him, I would think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I've often thought about in recent days, since Doug's passing, when he arrived at Waterloo in 1958, there was just one academic building. It's the one that is now named after him. But in those days, it was called Chemistry and Chemical Engineering. There was an old farmhouse and two what we call portable buildings, and that was it. That was the campus. And he blew in from Queens, where he'd been having a very successful career, but was frustrated by the lack of change. And he really wanted to introduce a modern curriculum and modern design. And he once said to me, the advantage of Waterloo was there were no precedents. There were no old professors. There was nobody here saying you can do this, you can't do that. It was all a blank slate. And he said, I was just what I wanted.
And he sounds like the man for the job too. He did some really amazing things for Waterloo that continue on now to help students and help the university. Like, isn't he part of the reason why co-op is such an important part of engineering?
I think so, because there was a lot of opposition to co-op, and other universities were skeptical about Waterloo's engineering program. And Doug reversed all of that and had them admiring it within a short time, because he also introduced a strikingly new curriculum using mathematical modeling, finite mathematics, which none of the older universities were willing to do. And so he changed the way engineering was taught and the practice of engineering. And my favorite story was he also decided he would abandon the idea of engineering physics and introduce engineering as an honors program right across the board, rather than have an elitist engineering physics program and just other engineers. He said, that's not the way it's going to be at Waterloo. We're all going to be at the honors level in engineering. That was a really major change, and it was fought against by many people for many years. And we had actually hired someone to introduce that program because we were thinking of a standard engineering program. And Doug, it took him 2 years, but he did succeed.
I remember reading in your book, Waterloo at 50, that he was frustrated by this inertia at other institutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you explain that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is, and there's an explanation for it, other universities weren't interested in bringing about change. So they were still teaching engineering and drafting and the older techniques by professors who had taught at, say, at University of Toronto from before the First World War. And so they had precedence, they had seniority, and that's the way engineering was to be taught. Doug, by contrast, came out of wasn't in the war, but he studied engineering at what was called the Ajax campus at University of Toronto with veterans from the Second World War. That was where the veterans were sent to become engineers. And there was a restlessness and a need for change and a desire for change and a very frustrated feeling that Canada had not reached its potential. And that's the atmosphere out of which Doug emerged as a young engineer. And then when going on to Illinois and then to Cambridge, he learned, and he admitted this, he learned some of the really interesting modern engineering practices at those other two universities. So when he came back to Canada, he was insistent that we developed the most modern and effective engineering programs, and we still weren't doing it at other schools.
And look at us now.
And look at us now.
What about his time as president? What strikes you from that tenure?
Oh, Doug's time as president was like a whirlwind coming in. The interesting thing is, by contrast, Burt Matthews, previous president, had put things in place to modernize, but also to give policies and to give some kind of sense of stability. Doug burst on the scene and wanted to go back to the way it was in 1958. Everything was open, everything could be changed, nothing remained out of boundary for him, for his ideas. And so we entered into this rapid period of change again, almost destabilizing the university in some ways, but exciting, really exciting. And what he was pushing for was relevance and making us a modern, effective university again. And that's what he did. And he was interested in making partnerships with major industries across Canada. But that was also part of the Waterloo ethos. We were involved through co-op and in relationships with other major companies that were hiring our students. And they also had an advisory council which brought major companies to the campus. And what Doug introduced, the big thing from my point of view, was the Institute for Computer Research, where he drew all those programs involving computers together into one system, and then pushed the province of Ontario to work with him on that. And they created the William G. Davis Centre for Computer Research at a time when there were no new buildings being built anywhere in the province. That was a huge leap forward. And of course, the criticisms were, well, we don't have a budget for cleaning the building, and we don't have this, we don't have that. But Doug was not to be stopped. And of course, it was critical for our success, including, the two then major spin-off companies, one of which is now called OpenText, and the other one was Waterloo Maple or MapleSoft,
right?
Both of which spun off out of that synergy that he created. I'm not saying he created them, but
No.
But if we didn't have the ICR, what they said was we had created and he created this as well, a kind of an awareness that this kind of research was appropriate for a university. And he wanted to encourage that. And people knew if they came here, they could do that kind of work and also spin it off. Whereas at other places, the university would have owned the property rights and spin-off companies were going to be restricted. I'm not saying that Doug created the policy. I'm just saying he encouraged it dramatically.
But also during his tenure as president, there was a significant change to senior administration responsibilities, I understand.
Yes, that is kind of interesting, and often that's not fully recorded. But Doug was so keenly developing the reputation for the University of Waterloo everywhere. They had to create a position. The leading on campus was the vice president academic and provost. With Doug as president, the position of provost was established in a more significant way for the day-to-day operation of the campus and its policies and its procedures. And he was the idea man promoting Waterloo across Canada and around the world. So the provost position, which we now see as really central to the daily operation, came about in the midst of Doug's tenure as president.
Because he was being the rainmaker.
Some people would have said that. It just wasn't in his interest. The petty detail of day-to-day operations were important, but it wasn't where his interests lie.
Between being the dean of engineering and being president, Doug, he went to work at Queen's Park.
Yes, he did.
Now, I say he went to Queen's Park. I don't want to give people the impression that he was an elected official. He was not.
Deputy minister. Well, he advised first on universities and colleges, and that's the recasting the whole system of funding for universities in Ontario. And he also looked into post-secondary education, which involved recreating and advising the government about the relationship between community colleges and university systems. And then he went on into social policy and social welfare systems. And so he, as a senior administrative advisor, he was in 3 different portfolios over time and fundamentally changed each of them.
What was the impact of the work that he did there?
Well, the impact was profound because he looked at all post-secondary education, which included the beginning of the concept of community colleges and trying to integrate them into a system. But for us at Waterloo, and one of the things Doug used to tell me about and chuckle was he created the operating system, which we then called basic income units, so that all universities received the same formula for grants, so that there was a single tier of universities, not originally they thought, well, we have a two-tier system.
Oh,
University of Toronto, Queen's, Western, the older universities were at the top with the big established programs, and the other universities would be primarily undergraduate and not research oriented. And by changing the funding system so that all universities were funded in the same manner, we have then created what we now call the single tier system, where all universities in Ontario are able to develop equally. And Doug laughed and said, that was really interesting because the older universities really wanted the income and didn't realize the implication of it. He was just so restless and so full of ideas. And it was fascinating to be with him because I've never known anyone with as many ideas per minute as Doug Wright had.
what should the people who are students now, who only know Doug Wright as a name on a building, what should they know that he did for them?
That he put the University of Waterloo academically in a leading position in Canada. When Maclean's magazine began ranking universities, and at the beginning, the University of Waterloo was fairly low on that ranking, Doug was furious because he felt it was unfair because they put medical schools along with all the other universities. And he actually, and I was with him when he did this, met with the person at Maclean's who was organizing the university survey and was persuaded her that we ought to have the three categories: comprehensive, major research, and undergraduate primarily categories. And then we also ought to be looking at things like leaders of tomorrow, most innovative, as separate categories. So Waterloo went from, I don't remember what its place was, but it was middling rank, to number one, number one, number one, number one. And I think people at the University of Waterloo should say thank you to Doug Wright for his perception that the system needed to be amended. But realized that because he had chaired the committee in Ontario on post-secondary education, he understood universities and their place and their status and their techniques of operating probably better than most people. He believed Waterloo was much better than that ranking gave us originally. And ever since then, the rankings have demonstrated that he was right.
Wow. Well, Ken, you know more about Waterloo than anyone I know.
Maybe you don't know enough people. You know more
No,
people.
you're being modest. You know a lot. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to help us learn more about Doug Wright, a man to whom we obviously owe a lot.
Well, you're quite welcome. It's fun. And, the last thing we got to say about Doug Wright is his loyalty to his family, because we don't think of them because of all the professional items. But if you talk to Doug long enough, his children and his grandchildren entered into the conversation always. And I think that's important to know as well, the human side of Doug.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for that insight as well. He was a well-rounded man.
Yes, he was.
Thank you for listening to this interview from the Beyond the Bulletin podcast from the University of Waterloo. You'll find our archive of full episodes on the University of Waterloo website, and select interviews are on the university's YouTube channel. Just look for our playlist there. I hope you'll join Brandon Sweet and me for new episodes on Fridays, and please tell your Waterloo connections about us.